In August of 1928, largely at the instigation of U.S. Secretary of State Frank B. Kellogg, 63 nations agreed to ban war. Thus, the perceived contradiction when the following February, President Coolidge, with less than a month left in office, signed a bill to construct 16 new war ships. The 1929 Cruiser Act raised some opposition among people who believed that war had become obsolete, but the ships built under the act would be workhorses in the war that was to come.
It is, perhaps, one of the greatest ironies in history that the first person to sign the 1928 Kellogg-Briand Pact, named after Secretary Kellogg and French Foreign Minister Aristide Briand, was Gustav Stresemann, the German foreign minister. The Associated Press noted that Dr. Stresemann, who had received the Nobel Prize in 1926, was the first German foreign minister received in Paris since the War of 1870. The ceremony in which the first 15 nations signed the treaty was an august affair. The AP noted that the inkwell used to sign was the same one used to sign the first Franco-American Treaty, negotiated by Benjamin Franklin in 1788. It was an ambitious pact, although it only included 2 articles and relatively few words. Article 1. The high contracting parties solemnly declare, in the names of their respective peoples, that they condemn recourse to war for the solution of international controversies, and renounce it as an instrument of national policy in their relations with one another. Article 2. The high contracting parties agree that the settlement or solution of all disputes or conflicts of whatever nature or of whatever origin they may be, which may arise among them, shall never be sought, except by pacific means. John Tierney, Professor Emeritus of the Graduate School of the Institute of World Politics and former Special Assistant and Foreign Affairs Officer for the U.S. Arms Control and Disarmament Agency, explains, the pact was signed by 62 countries of the world, and most people, especially in the U.S. and France, believed that it would lead to an eventual peace on earth based on political liberty.
Having just endured the horrors of the war to end all wars, world leaders got together and decided to end the use of war as a matter of national policy. If only it were so.
The Kellogg-Briand Pact was not the only high-minded attempt to avoid another war like the Great War that had killed tens of millions of people and left much of the world devastated. Recognizing that the competition of a naval arms race had both drained nations' resources and been a driver of the war, in 1922 major naval powers had agreed on naval limits intended to maintain a balance of power that would prevent another such arms race and war. The Washington Naval Treaty, signed in 1922, was a disarmament treaty, actually calling to scrap naval vessels planned or under construction, recognizing both strict limits on the size of vessels of different classes, but also total tonnage of capital ships via defined ratios between the nations involved. The treaty was of particular interest in the United States, whose response to the war was largely defined by a policy of non-interventionism, where there was little appetite for naval spending. The immediate goal was to reduce tensions in the Far East. As the Office of the Historian of the U.S. Department of State explains, in the wake of World War I, leaders in the international community sought to prevent the possibility of another war. Rising Japanese militarism and an international arms race heightened these concerns. As a result, policymakers worked to reduce the rising threat. The website of the National World War II Museum explains, collectively, the treaties that emerged from the Washington Conference established a dynamic in the Pacific that scholars have called the Washington Conference system, where the major powers of the Asia-Pacific region agreed to work together, despite their differences, to preserve peace and stability. So why, when war had been outlawed and the taste for more government spending was limited, was the U.S. seeking to build more expensive warships? The question is even more difficult to answer given America at the time. Kellogg was the Secretary of State under President Calvin Coolidge, and Coolidge did not like to spend the people's money. The website of the Library of Congress explains Coolidge's great policy concern was economy in government. He assumed office in August 1923 upon the death of Warren G. Harding and served as president for 6 years. During that time, he concerned himself with such measures as paying off the national debt, eliminating waste, and cutting taxes to stimulate capital investment. Thus, the odd decision for the administration that had just worked to ban war and that did not like to spend money to drastically increase the size of the United States Navy. Secretary of the Navy Curtis D. Wilbur, with Coolidge's backing, proposed an ambitious plan to add 74 ships to the Navy at the astronomical cost of $740 million. Understand, in 1929, the entire federal budget was just around $3.6 billion. Why? In a simple sense, the naval treaties in Kellogg-Briand Pact had their limits. The most notable with the Kellogg-Briand Pact was the lack of any enforcement mechanism. Despite the high-minded agreement, the success of the pact simply depended upon the nations being true to their word and trust that others would as well. The criticism has been, in retrospect, often quite biting. As Tierney notes, typical was commentator Eric Severide's assessment of the pact on national television as a worthless piece of paper. Historian Ian Kershaw summarized history's verdict on the pact as vacuous, and that it was a dead letter from the moment it was signed. What, for example, was to happen if militaristic governments arose that had little respect for the pact? Could fascist Italy under Benito Mussolini really be trusted to stay true to their signature on that worthless piece of paper? As to the naval treaty, while it limited numbers of large capital ships and tonnage of smaller vessels, it did not limit the numbers of smaller vessels. Thus, it essentially created another arms race, just among other vessels. Illinois Representative Frederick Albert Britton explained, but the treaty failed to put a limitation on smaller fighting units, ships under 10,000 tons each in displacement and guns not exceeding 8 inches in caliber. What happened? Almost immediately, every power party to the treaty, except the United States, began a tremendous shipbuilding program. The result was the arms race the treaty was intended to prevent. Despite the complaint offered by Henry Sudium, who had been the secretary of the U.S. delegation to the 1921 Naval Treaty in the Brooklyn Eagle, that the most unfortunate aspect of the present development is not so much that it signifies a great enlargement in the American naval strength, as that it coincides with the ratification of the treaty for the renunciation of war. There is no intrinsic conflict between the two conceptions, he writes, at least on a realistic viewpoint. But in the moral standpoint, the contrast is objectionable. The fact is that even Coolidge didn't trust that the treaties to which the nation was a party would be followed by other powers. The mistrust of foreign governments was on full display in the argument made for the new cruiser building program by Virginia Senator Claude A. Swanson. We cannot understand why Great Britain would add to her navy so many cruisers, except for the purpose of establishing naval supremacy against us. She desires to be mistress of the sea, as she has been for centuries, and make her will the law of the seas. As reporter R.M. Lynn summarized Swanson's argument in the Newport News, Virginia Daily Press. If any one nation is to be mistress of the seas, Senator Swanson of Virginia prefers that power be exercised by the United States rather than by Great Britain or any other nation. The senator proclaimed, I am unwilling, either by treaty, agreement, or by failure to have an adequate navy, to concede this right to Great Britain. It seems strange today to conceive of the idea that just a decade after allying during the Great War and only a little over a decade before joining an alliance again, that the U.S. and Great Britain, who had no great policy disputes, were still concerned with the possibility of war between each other. And of course, Great Britain was not the only concern. U.S. Navy Captain N.H. Goss, described as a noted authority on naval power, was quoted in the New York American. In considering the cruiser problem, the Japanese position is also of interest. Despite the position of their main islands, which lie like a fender in front of their essential markets and source of raw materials in China, Manchuria, and Siberia, the Japanese have also proceeded to build up a formidable cruiser force of not less than 29 vessels, all of which are modern. Arguing that cruisers are invaluable for scouting and convoy work, Goss describes a new U.S. cruiser program as essentially defensive in nature, as a way to protect commerce. Thus, he argues a program to increase U.S. cruiser strength was a necessary outcome of the deficiencies of the Naval Conference and the Kellogg-Briand Pact. The increase in the effective strength of our fleet by the construction of the cruisers included in our program would not make the Kellogg Treaty less effective, but would help to make it less apt to be violated by interpretations in favor of individual nations. These competing interests met in the U.S. Senate. As Time magazine explained, did the U.S. need more light cruisers? In view of the passage of the Kellogg Peace Treaty, should the U.S. feel that appropriating money for more naval armament would be a belligerent act? The issues were complex and contested. The question seemed likely to absorb the Senate for a good part of the present session. Time described the opposing sides. A large part of the Senate agrees that the cruiser is essential for the protection of U.S. commerce, that the Navy's lack of cruisers should be rectified. While the opposition, or small Navy group, is small in number, robust in spirit, A possible filibuster from the source is conceived to be the only obstacle to the bill's passage. There was an early and notable victory for the small Navy crowd, however. The original proposal for 75 ships was cut to just 16. Professor Lowell A. Coate wrote in the Llano Colonist of New Llano, Louisiana, that reduction being directly due to the pressure of public opinion against the original proposal by the Naval Department. But as to the 1929 cruiser bill, success, the professor explains, was guaranteed. It is a bill for which the necessary votes had been gathered before ever the session of Congress opened. The only matter of discussion was a time limit set on when the ships would be built, a provision with which Coolidge disagreed, believing the process should be left up to the executive. The provision and threatened filibuster were not enough. The Senate passed the bill by a vote of 68 to 12 on February 5th. On February 13th, the president signed it, and it became law. The bill authorized the construction of 15 light cruisers and 1 airplane carrier. Construction was to begin on 5 cruisers per year in the fiscal years ending June 30th, 1929, 1930, and 1931.
And so the cruisers of the 1929 cruiser bill, which were built ostensibly to prevent war, would end up fighting one. These were the Coolidge Cruisers.
While 15 cruisers were authorized, only 9 would be built. Originally described as light cruisers owing to their armor type, under the new terms of the 1930 adjustment to the Naval Treaty, being armed with 8-inch guns, they were classified as heavy cruisers. Together, the 9 ships, 2 of the Portland class and 7 of the New Orleans class, would earn 90 battle stars, indicators of a participation in major battles of the war. Coolidge's cruisers fought at the front of every major battle in the Pacific. 2 were at Pearl Harbor. Portland rescued survivors of the USS Lexington at Coral Sea and USS Yorktown at Midway. 3, USS Quincy, Vincennes, and Astoria were sunk in the bloody fighting at the August 1942 Battle of Savo Island, finding their final resting place at Iron Bottom Sound. 2 were there to get revenge for Pearl Harbor at Surigao Strait. Indianapolis delivered the parts of the atomic bomb to Tinian Island, only to be torpedoed in one of the tragic stories of the war. They bombarded Guadalcanal, Saipan, Leyte, Tarawa, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. The Coolidge Cruisers were among America's most decorated ships of the Second World War. The act also authorized the construction of 1 aircraft carrier, USS Ranger, the first U.S. Navy ship built from the keel up as an aircraft carrier. While small for a fleet carrier, Ranger served in the Atlantic Theater, supported the landings in North Africa, ferried aircraft, and trained pilots. Lessons learned from her design were instrumental in the design of the excellent Essex class.
And so it was the terms of the Kellogg-Briand Pact and the Washington Naval Treaties that were intended to prevent war that were used as the justification for the United States Navy to build more warships. And if there's an irony that in seeking peace it led to the construction of weapons of war, it's part of a cycle of irony. For example, it was the destruction of the Great War that led to the peace movement. And yet that destruction laid the groundwork for the Great Depression by destroying economies and creating international debt and disrupting world trade. And in many ways, it was the deprivation of the Great Depression that would lead to the rise of extremism that would make war inevitable and the peace movement futile. And in a further irony, in seeking that peace, it almost would have prevented us from building the ships that we would need in the coming war. The 1929 Cruiser Act was just one step in the process of building a Navy that would eventually eclipse all others. But the Coolidge Cruisers were there when we needed them most. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.